Okay. Um, Hello, how's it going? I'm just getting things set up here with the streaming recording. I want to make sure that this is working here. Um, so in this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to make your own color chart, and specifically for a complementary color palette. So again, if we're thinking about the color wheel, complementary colors are colors that are directly opposite from one another on the color wheel. And when you're making your color chart, you can pick whichever two colors you want to use as your opposing hues for this chart. So this is an example that I made a few years ago using a blue and orange complementary color scheme. And this one was made with Ultramarine Blue, which is this color directly out of the tube, and then Burnt Sienna is a pigment that is within the hue of orange, so that's what I use as my orange color. You have access to both of these colors with the palette that I ordered for this current semester in 2026. So you could do this palette if you wanted to for your color chart. For this demonstration, I'm going to be making a palette with yellow and violet. So those will be my two opposing ends of the color chart. And in the instructions for project 3, this is part of the assignment, is to make one of these color charts. You have an option to make one that is either 3 different values or 2 different values. So in this recording, I wanted to demonstrate making one that is 2 different values. Either way, you have to have 5 rows. So you can see between both of these that there are 5 different rows. And that would give you either 15 swatches, like in this chart, or 10 swatches, like in the lower chart here, which is the one I'm going to be making. And to make a chart, you'll need a ruler. It really helps if you have one of these right angle rulers. If you have a regular ruler, that's okay too. You can just measure along the edge of your paper, which generally should have a pretty square edge. And then the size of the squares is up to you. So in the larger example, these are 1.5 inches wide, and then these ones are 1 inch, square. So it's really up to you what size you want to go with. Sometimes it's nice to have a larger swatch chart. You can really compare and see color contrasts a lot easier with a larger grid, but that requires you to use a little bit more paint for that chart. So I would recommend, if you're going to be doing 2 columns, maybe go with the 1.5 inch squares. If you're going to go with 3 columns, maybe go with the 1 inch squares, just thinking about paint and how much paint you're going to need. So the first thing that you have to do after you have your grid drawn out on your oil painting paper with pencil, you could use pen if you want to, you want to grab your colors that you'll be using. So also in the instructions for this assignment, I recommend to have one of your 2 complementary colors be a primary color. So for example, if you chose red and green as your complements, that would work. Orange and blue would also work, since blue is a primary color, and then violet and yellow would also work for those, that requirement of having a primary color. The main reason I encourage you to do this is because if you pick something like blue-violet and yellow-orange, chances are we don't have one of those 2 colors directly out of a tube of paint that we have access to this semester. So by picking a primary color as one of your 2 complements, it's going to save you a lot of time, and it's going to make making the painting for this assignment a lot easier in terms of getting back to one of your 2 complementary colors. So by having my ultramarine blue as one of my 2 colors, that really helped me save a lot of time to make this grid. If you wanted to do this scheme, the burnt sienna is orange enough where you don't need to mix in like a yellow or extra red. If you wanted to make a different orange, you can totally mix yellow and red together, or yellow and Quinacridone Magenta together. But typically at this point in the semester, I think it's worth simplifying the process as much as possible. So I'm choosing to do a different chart because I already have one with blue and orange. For this one, let's make one with yellow and violet. So I'm going to use Cadmium Yellow Medium, which is very oily. And actually, I'm going to grab a glove real quick. Because I'm using cadmium, it's good to be safe and wear proper gloves. That way the pigment doesn't leach into my skin. The cadmium pigments that are in your supply list for this class, if the tubes say hue, then they don't have traditional cadmium pigment in them. I'm fairly certain about that, but so because I'm using a traditional cadmium, I want to make sure that I have gloves. And then to make a violet, I'm going to be mixing Ultramarine Blue with Quinacridone Magenta. Now, just as a disclaimer for this demonstration, and honestly for all of the demonstrations this semester, my paintings and examples are going to look slightly different than yours because I don't have the same brand of paint and pigments that you're working with. But in general, things should be fairly close to the results that I'm sharing with you in class. But just take that into account that your results may not look exactly like mine during the semester. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make the color that is not a primary first. So I'm going to mix up a violet, and I want to start with the two colors that are going to make my violet. So I have my Quinacridone Magenta here and my Ultramarine Blue. Just by looking at the two right off the bat, to me the Ultramarine Blue seems quite a bit darker. So I'm going to start with Quinacridone Magenta as my first color, and then I want to add in Ultramarine Blue in small increments. So because we're trying to make a purple or a violet, what I'm doing now is I'm trying to get to a mixture that feels like it's kind of in between the hues of these two pigments. And then when I'm going to reach back into my Ultramarine Blue, usually I get in the habit of wiping my palette knife. That way I'm not jeopardizing the pile of Ultramarine Blue in case I needed that for another mixture on my palette. Now we'll see if I will need to mix up more paint to be able to complete this color chart. I have a feeling I will have to, but for the purpose of the demonstration, I think we'll just keep going with the amount of paint that I currently have. We're getting closer now to what I would call traditional violet. I don't want it to be too red. I don't want this to look like a red violet, but I also don't want this to look like a blue violet. So as I'm mixing, both of these colors are fairly transparent pigments, so it's pretty easy to see through the colors and kind of gauge some of the color temperature. It's easier for me in person than I'm sure it appears on screen. One thing I'll do is I'll take a little tiny bit of white. I don't even know if you can see what's on the palette knife, but then kind of on the periphery of the pile, just so I can see what's happening here. This will give me a good idea of what that color actually looks like. Now it's fairly purple, but it still seems a little warm. So I'm going to take a little bit more Ultramarine Blue. Hopefully you can see that. And we're going to mix that into the pile. Now I wouldn't recommend mixing your paint on a palette that's held up vertically like this. This is just to make it easier for you to see my process here. Maybe just a little bit more Ultramarine Blue. Some of this doesn't have to be like textbook perfect in terms of the hues, but for sure you don't want to make a color chart that's yellow and blue, right? We're trying to study what happens when we mix complementary colors together, right? So hues that are opposite the color wheel. So for this chart to really work effectively, we want to start out with two colors that inherently are complementary. That way when we cross mix them, we should find a sweet spot where there's an achromatic neutral between those two colors. Now, I already know I'm going to need more paint to complete my chart, so I'm just going to go ahead and put a little bit more of this Quinacridone Magenta on my palette. I'll just bring that right in here. Add in a bit more Ultramarine Blue. Now, there may be times where you'll feel like you're wasting your time, potentially, in terms of like starting to mix a color and then realizing you don't have enough paint, so you have to mix more. The good news about that is that it does feel that way when you have to add more paint and remix your color mixture that you're trying to create. But the good news is that every time we mix our pigments on our palette, we're training our eyes to be able to notice the subtle differences between all of our colors. So as time goes on, you'll become more familiar with how powerful the pigments are in comparison to one another. A term that we often associate to that phenomenon as we mix colors is tinting strength. So when we say the tinting strength of a pigment is really high, what we're saying is that that color, the pigment in that color of paint, is very powerful in terms of how it mixes with other colors on your palette. So what happens is you'll start to notice that certain colors just have a very high tinting strength, while other colors have a very low tinting strength. And the more we paint and the more we use these same colors throughout the semester, the more familiar we're going to become with understanding how much paint we need when we're mixing those colors to get a desired secondary mixture. Something we'll also typically say is when you're trying to find a color that is mixed after combining two other colors, the first two colors are typically associated as, or we typically call them the parent colors, the parent mixture of colors. And then this is sort of like the offspring color of these two when they're mixed together. So that can be another way to kind of start to remember and familiarize yourself with what two different colors are going to do when you mix them directly out of the tube. So both of these are coming right out of a tube of paint that I have here in my studio. But I think that this is a lot more violet. Hopefully you can kind of start to see the difference in terms of temperature between these two piles here. So I like what I'm seeing. It doesn't seem quite as warm as that initial mixture over here. So I'm going to go ahead and use this now as my violet in the painting. Okay, so now that I have my complementary colors here, the first thing I want to do is try to find that middle neutral. And basically what happens now is I will pick in my chart, I can say this is going to be yellow, this is going to be violet, this is my middle neutral, and then these will be my tints, T-I-N-T-S over here. And I'll probably try to go with something kind of close to this value over here. So basically I'm going to make a chart that has this level of value and this level of value. And this might not be exactly the same in terms of lightness and darkness as these two colors. Since yellow is so much brighter than burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, this middle value is going to be quite a bit lighter. I'm assuming, but we'll find out as I mix in these colors. So if it helps you, you can label your chart in a similar way by identifying which top and bottom part of your column is going to be which of the two colors in the chart. Okay, so typically what I prefer to do is put out my mixtures, or what we'll call color strings, on my palette first, and then once I like the relationships that I'm seeing on the palette, then I'll plug in all of the colors in the chart. That seems to be a lot more effective. That way if something is off in the chart, I'm not trying to scrape out a little tiny square that could jeopardize the rest of the chart and that kind of thing. So let's see, I'm going to adjust the camera here just a little bit, and maybe I'll also increase our view so you have a better sense of what I'm seeing. All right, so obviously we have yellow on one side of the column over here. So this will be my pure yellow that will be filled in here. Now I'm going to need to make a middle neutral down here. Now in general, again, kind of like with the Quinacridone Magenta and the Ultramarine Blue, anytime you're mixing two colors, I highly recommend starting with the lighter color in terms of value. It's a lot easier to darken a light color than it is to lighten a dark color, if that makes sense. Especially once you start to realize which pigments are higher in tinting strength, you might need to use a lot of yellow to bring this purple up to that neutral value that we're going to find here. So I would start with your yellow instead of the violet. And then our violet, let's grab a pile of violet to put down here at the bottom. So this can be a way to sort of visualize the color string. And then I'll need a little bit less violet, so I'm going to put some down here, and I need to make sure I have enough paint to fill in the swatch on my chart. So what I also recommend keeping in mind is that these charts need to be opaque. So all of the colors that we see here, we're not actually seeing through translucent paint. These are all opaque squares of oil paint that are dry now. But the important thing is that we're just comparing the inherent properties of the color and not seeing the paper through the paint, interacting or influencing any of the color properties. So for these charts to be really helpful in our toolkit, we want to make sure that we're using enough paint that it's opaque on the surface of our chart. Now, if you're worried about using too much paint, this is where I would recommend then doing a smaller 1" by 1" chart of squares. That way, you can save more of your paint for your paintings. Okay, this is how I would start out. I would put your top 3 colors of the same lighter color at the top, the 2 darker ones at the bottom, and then what we can start to do now is find this middle neutral. So I'm going to take a little bit of violet. Hopefully you can see about how much I have on my palette knife, because I don't know how much this is going to influence the yellow here on the palette, but let's find out. So as I'm doing this, the thing I'm really aware of and thinking about is, does this mixture have any sense of hue? So I would say yes, this is a very golden, warm color, so it needs quite a bit more of our violet. So again, I don't want to push this too close to violet, so I'm just going to inch my way towards a neutral here. So this still feels very warm, not as bright or golden as the initial mixture, but still reads as a pretty warm color. So let's grab some more violet here. I'm going to increase the amount of violet that I have. I have a feeling that this is going to be a fairly dark, muted mixture. Again, this might be different for your pigments because of the cadmium yellow hue as opposed to the cadmium yellow. There might be a different level of tinting strength between our pigments that I'm using versus yours. And the other thing I want to say too is if you don't want to make your chart with cadmium yellow hue, you can use Hansa Yellow Light instead. It's just going to have a different sense of temperature between warmer or cooler. But there's no requirement in terms of which blues to use, which reds to use, which yellows to use. It's up to you. Just know that whatever you do choose to use in these charts will be different than if you had used a different pigment to start out with. So we're getting closer. This is still fairly, this is reading more like a brown, so that tells me that I still need to add in more of our violet color here. Now if you're using ultramarine blue and burnt sienna like I did in the other example, what you'll notice is that the mixture that you create is a very dark value, and it can be difficult to tell when it's neutral. So kind of like I did with the violet, just to be able to see the properties of the color, I would recommend doing these little peripheral tints of whatever that mixture is. So I'm at a point now where I can probably try that with this. So I'm going to scoop it into a nice clean pile, and then that way if I add a little bit of white, kind of like this, I can start to see if this is reading as more purple or more yellow. And it's pretty close to being kind of a purple. It's kind of difficult to tell if it's more purplish or more brown. I have a feeling it might need a little bit more yellow now, so I'm going to take a small amount of yellow here. And I'm going to mix that with this larger pile that I had. I probably didn't give myself enough space to do this, but you know, that's okay. So I'm just going to take this over there, a little bit of white again. So it's looking pretty close. What might happen is, because Cadmium Yellow Medium is a very warm pigment, it might not be a perfect neutral. In theory, we should be able to get to a perfect achromatic neutral. Now what I'm going to try to do is add a little bit more of my violet here, just to see if this can cool off my middle mixture. Typically this is the most time intensive part of this project, is just trying to find that achromatic neutral. Let's add a little bit more violet here. Here. Okay, it still seems a little too warm, so I'm going to grab more of my violet again. Actually, what I want to do is clean off this area here. Leave a little bit of residue on the periphery again, just so I have something to mix with the white. So I'm adding in the last of the violet that I have. Now, the other thing that we're kind of thinking about while we're working on this chart is that as we're mixing our different swatches, we're also thinking about the distance between those two different neighboring colors. So with this middle neutral, what I'm also trying to do is find a color that visually feels like it's in between yellow and violet in terms of hue and in terms of temperature. Now, based on the pigments that I'm starting with, these can all lean a little bit more warm, and so if all three of these colors initially are very warm, then that neutral is going to be slightly warmer. Now with Ultramarine Blue and Burnt Sienna, those two colors are a little bit more complementary in terms of orange to blue, and it was a lot easier to get to a more perfect neutral. Now what I'll probably try to do at some point outside of this live stream video is try this again, maybe with a few other yellows, just to see if there's a more balanced palette to do this particular color chart on. But again, regardless, this is going to be really helpful for us to see what that range of the palette is going to look like. So now what I'm going to do is take a little bit of this middle mixture and add that into my second yellow here. So basically we want our neutral color to lean slightly towards yellow. It can still be fairly muted. And I can just grab a little bit of this extra violet that's almost gone up here, just to push this slightly more towards the middle of our chroma. So you can see now why it helps to have quite a bit more paint when you're doing this project. And then what I'll do is take a little bit of our neutral again and add that into this second pile down here. Now if it feels like it's too close to my violet, what I'll most likely do is grab a little bit of cadmium yellow to bring this closer to my middle neutral color, which I think I'm going to do. Just a small amount of yellow. So now what we'll do is we'll start working on our tints for this second column here. So I'm going to start by grabbing piles of white, and then I'll take a little bit of my yellow. Again, a little goes a long way, so we're just trying to get a tinted version of the yellow, which this looks good. You can think of this kind of as like a pastel color, but for sure a higher key is going to be really helpful. I wouldn't do a subtle jump in value. I think for a 2-column chart, it helps to have a more extreme range between your values. That'll be a lot more useful as a chart for your painting process. I'm going to take a little bit of this color here. Doesn't take a lot to tint this. Plus I'm also trying to preserve some of the pile. That way I have enough paint to fill in the left column, since I should have added more paint when I made my violet. Now, sometimes what will happen is you'll overmix the amount of paint that you need for a color chart, but the good news is if you're going to start your painting, your 18 by 24 inch painting today, or over the next day or two, this paint should stay open and workable to be able to start using for your painting. So that's the good news in case you feel like you've overmixed your paint. I would not scrape whatever's left over from this and what was I going to say? So I'm already noticing that this is too violet here, this middle neutral. So this is also where it helps to be able to start tinting things up. So what I'm going to do now is add in more yellow to this mixture here. And again, I don't want to push it too close to the gold, but we'll see what happens when I add about that much into this pile. Now, I'm assuming what's going to happen is we'll end up with more of a brown, kind of muted neutral. So I'm just going to leave the paint that I have here on my palette knife, and I'm just going to go ahead and mix this right into the initial tint for this color. And that feels pretty good, actually. And we'll scoop this into a pile as well. And then we'll grab this color here. Again, we don't need a lot. We're just trying to tint our pile of white. So I don't know if you can see how much I have on my palette knife. So right away I can tell that these two colors are too close together. My middle neutral has some space to move towards the yellow side of the chart, but it's okay to get all the piles down and then compare them and figure out what needs to be adjusted. I think that's a fine way to make the chart. We'll grab a little bit of my violet now. Hopefully you can see that. And we'll tint that up. I should probably grab a little bit more white. You should really strive to have your tints similar in value. That way we're really just comparing the other properties. We're not really comparing the values between each pile. We're really just looking at which one is warmer, which one is cooler, and that sort of thing. Now, I don't know if you can tell, but it seems like this color is slightly more neutral than this one. So that means that the balance of yellow to violet in this pile is closer to a neutral. And what I can choose to do here is mix these two together to get something that's a little bit closer to this neutral color. Or even try to swap these two if one feels cooler than the other one. But what I'm noticing too, for sure, is like, obviously the yellow, the violet, those piles are ready to go into the chart. It's a matter of these three steps in the chart, and figuring out which ones are working currently for that level of distance between yellow to purple or violet. And part of what I'm noticing is that the value of this pile is very bright in comparison to its neighboring one, so that's also making it stand out. So what I'm going to do is grab a little bit more of this color just to darken this value. That way it's easier, again, to compare the other properties of the color to see, like, is it cool enough, is it neutral, is it warm? Which now I think that is a pretty strong jump between violet to more of a chromatic neutral. I do think that these piles can be slightly more yellow, so I'm just going to go ahead and add in a little bit more yellow to this middle pile here. Now I have to be careful because I don't have any more violet other than what's in these two piles here at the bottom. So again, I'll just leave the residue of the palette knife, mix it into this pile, and then we'll see where we're at. But I definitely think it could have a little bit more yellow overall. So let's grab just a touch of yellow, mix that in. So again, I'm comparing the sense of temperature and hue between the mixture that I'm working on and the color above and the color below it, and just trying to find a point where this mixture feels like it's equally placed between those two properties. And it's getting pretty close. Might be able to kind of leave things where they're at. Sometimes what you can also do, if it's difficult to tell when they're side by side, is put one of the colors on the back of your palette knife, and you can hover that color over your other piles, and that can help you maybe see things a little bit more directly here, in terms of how far of a jump it is between those two different colors. Now, part of the problem again might be a value thing, like these lower values on this color string might be darker than these two. So what can happen is I can either add in more white to these bottom three piles, 1, 2, 3, or I can bring a little bit more pigment into these piles. Now, I'm most worried about this pile here because there's just not very much paint to fill in my swatch. So that's a way to kind of maybe decide what direction you want to go in terms of adjusting your piles. So I think I'm just going to add in a little bit of white to these and raise the value up a little bit. Now I'm just thinking, like, as I'm working on this color string, something that might have helped allow me to get more of a neutral between yellow and violet could have been if I used phthalo blue instead of ultramarine blue with my quinacridone to make a violet. But this pairing or combination of two colors is going to give you the most vibrant or chromatic violet for this kind of a color string. So that's kind of up to you to decide. Now, if the violet seems very warm in terms of its temperature versus a more cool neutral with like a phthalo blue instead of ultramarine, you could try using the Hansa Yellow Light instead, and that's another experiment that can happen at any point in the future, which is kind of a nice reminder that a lot of these exercises are here for us just to learn and see the way that our pigments are interacting with one another. It's not so much about the results. I mean, it is important to get a result that's going to be a useful tool. So if you can get to that middle neutral, that means this is a more useful visual aid. But it's not the end of the world otherwise. So now let's see. Let's grab a few brushes to fill in my squares. I'm just going to start with these two synthetic flat brushes. This will give me a lot of control to fill in a fairly straight chart. And I grabbed two, that way I can start with the lighter yellow side and the darker purple side for my two brushes. So I think what I'm going to do is start with my kind of buttery yellow, my light yellow here. And we're going to put that in over here. You'll notice I did not use medium or Gamsol to thin out my paint. Again, this is because I want these charts to be opaque. Now, if I thin out the paint, there's a higher chance that we're going to be seeing through the paint and seeing some of the paper underneath the paint. And that can throw off the values, it can throw off the other properties of chroma and those sorts of things. Okay, so I'm going to wipe my brush, and I'm going to start now with the next square right below that. It's up to you how much time you want to spend once you have these colors mixed on your palette, like how much time you want to spend painting in your squares. You won't really be graded on. Obviously, you want these to be legible and you want these charts to be clean enough where we're really just comparing the colors side by side. So you want to make sure that you're painting these squares edge to edge, but they don't have to be like super perfect in terms of staying in those squares on the outside of the chart. It's more important that the paint is edge to edge on the inside of the chart. Okay. So right away I can tell I probably had a lot of room to pull these other values up higher, but for the sake of the video and the demonstration, I think it's okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and keep going. I'm going to go on to the next pile down in terms of value. So let's grab our somewhat neutral color here. We'll see how this ends up looking once the chart is complete, but right away you're going to notice a big difference in color properties because we're comparing this middle value or middle kind of neutral color to this warmer color above it. So it's going to read as a very purpley color, very cool color in terms of temperature. But once I add in the lower swatches, this middle color won't seem quite as intense. And this is an example of color relativity or simultaneous contrast. So when we're studying color theory, what we're really aiming to do is become effective at understanding relationships of colors. And the cool thing about understanding some of the sort of basic principles of color theory, as we'll continue to do and talk about in class is that it really doesn't matter what colors you have on your palette. I mean, this is what I found. It's really a lot more important to have a good understanding and a good foundation of the principles of color theory. So as we continue to work on our paintings in class, what we'll start to notice is that colors will feel like they're shifting between our palette and our surfaces that we're painting on. And the simple answer for that that phenomenon is that it's because our context is changing for whatever that mixture is. So we're going from the contrast of the palette, you know, whatever's around your pile of paint on the palette, to whatever is around that color in your painting. So it's sort of like the context is changing for that one color. The other thing that's really helpful about mixing on the palette first is that if I would have just tried to go with like an even 50-50 amount of paint for my violet and my yellow, chances are I wouldn't have had a very perfect or even color. And then if I would have just painted that directly into my chart, chances are I would plug everything else in and realize that something is too warm or too cool or too light or too dark. So it's really important to initially compare your color mixtures on your palette first. Now, if you don't have a palette that offers enough space to be able to have all of the mixtures, like if you're doing a 10 swatch color chart like I'm doing right now, you want to make sure that your palette has enough space for you to mix all 10 colors so you can compare them on the palette first. If you don't have a palette like that, you can use fairly simple materials as a surface for your palette. One thing you can probably find, I would assume relatively easily, is freezer paper, or I feel like that's the main name for that material. It's usually a roll of paper that's very slick on one side, that we usually use with, preserving food in freezers. And because that one side is very slick, it becomes a really good surface for mixing oil paint on, and it's not as fragile as like a piece of glass, for example. But hopefully now, even just with this one side, we're already able to see those contrasts of color, temperature, and where something is more chromatic and less chromatic. So now that I have that side done, I'm just going to wipe my brush and try to get as much of the paint out as possible. I didn't use any Gamsol. I don't typically use Gamsol when I'm working in my studio just because of health concerns, but being in a larger space at the painting studio in Morris, it's less of a concern to have Gamsol as part of your process. But again, just as a reminder, I encourage everyone to keep the lid on those containers whenever you're not, dipping a brush in the container, and that'll help cut back on some of the fumes and things that are evaporating from your Gamsol. So I'm going to use the same brush. I figured, save on time for cleaning, clean up today. So I'm just going to wipe the brush clean, and now I'm already jumping into my pure yellow swatch here. So again, I'm trying to keep this swatch as opaque as possible. I don't want to see the paper through the paint. One thing I would recommend, and the reason I like using a synthetic brush is because it's a very soft hair brush, is that unlike a bristle brush, I'm not seeing all of those little ridges from the stiff hairs on the brush. Synthetic brushes allow me to get a really smooth mark and surface, and typically I try to keep the direction of my brush strokes for a chart like this fairly cohesive and similar in terms of the direction. So I try to make sure that as much of the swatch is moving vertically. You know, obviously you can kind of decide what orientation your chart is meant to be viewed. I set this up so we're looking at it basically like how I would always look at this chart. So the yellow's at the top, the violet's at the bottom. But because of that, I'm trying to keep all of my marks as vertical as possible. That way when light is hitting the chart, I'm not getting a lot of glare that I would get if I was leaving a lot of horizontal marks. That's something that I typically am more conscientious of when I'm making a nocturne painting, just a painting that has a lot of dark passages of color. You know, if you want a painting to feel very dark and moody, especially if you end up varnishing it, you want to make sure that you're keeping those passages as smooth as possible in terms of your brushstrokes, or at the very least, if you don't want it to be distracting with glare, then I recommend that you move your brushstrokes in a vertical orientation. This was the swatch that I was most concerned about with having enough paint, so I'm just kind of needing to stretch this as much as I can. It's not going to be quite as opaque as the other ones, but most of the square seems to be covering the paper fairly well, so I'm not too concerned about that. But again, this, you know, learn from my mistakes. This is really where you want to make sure that you have more paint than less paint, if that makes sense. So you'll help your future self out if you use a little bit more paint than you think you're going to need. Now again, the really important thing is that we have our colors going edge to edge. Which with this brush right now, it's a little bit of a challenge to get it nice and clean all the way up to my lighter version of the color. But that looks pretty good. We'll keep on moving. All right, now we'll add in our what we're calling our neutral color. You know, I think part of the reason I was struggling so much with this color was because I was comparing it to the background of my palette, which is for the most part a very neutral color. This is just a piece of MDF medium density fiberboard that was gessoed initially to be a painting, and then if I remember correctly, this was a piece of like a surface that I had primed for some outdoor plein air paintings that I was making in Arizona back in 2017. And then I got out to my location and didn't have a palette. So I was like, well, I guess I'll just use this extra panel that I primed, and I just continued to use it as a palette ever since. And because I've used it for probably a few hundred different paintings and exercises like this, it has a lot of layers of paint. And what happens is with oil paint, because of the oil in our paint, we end up creating a patina on the surface of our palettes if they're a wood palette especially. But because of the oil, every time I would clean the palette, it creates this really kind of glass-like slick surface. And this is how most traditional wooden palettes sort of turn out for oil painters as they continue to use them. They are essentially seasoning and buffing the surface of their wooden palettes every time they clean or wipe off the surface. So it becomes sort of this really nice surface to mix on, but because there's just hundreds of layers of oil paint mixtures, basically that means that the color below whatever I'm mixing is not a perfect neutral. They do sell palettes of palette paper that you can buy that are kind of like this middle neutral color, and they're disposable palettes. It's really an effective tool if you're thinking about a new palette for your process in your studio. I know that Jack Richardson and Company is a supplier and manufacturer of art supplies in Wisconsin. They have a really great, paper palette for oil painting. I mean, you can use it also for other painting mediums, but I've mostly used it for oil painting. Okay, we're almost done with this chart. I'm glad I'm doing this today before class because this will be a good example to share with the homework instructions, and that way you can see what I mean when I am saying you can either do a 15 swatch chart or a 10 swatch chart, and you can also do smaller or larger squares. So this way you can see all different examples of that part of the assignment. Running into the same problem as I was with one of the other squares. Just trying to make sure I have enough paint. Okay, that looks pretty good. Obviously you can see where my line is a little bit past the pencil line there, and I'm not worried about that. That's really not a big deal. Again, you're not going to be graded too heavily on like how perfect each square is. It's mostly about the color. That's why we're doing this, is to really study the effects of the colors. So don't get hung up on trying to make a perfect, like geometrically perfect chart. But again, the cleaner your chart is, I think the easier it is to focus on what's happening with the colors. So that's why that part of this is important. I'm just starting with the horizontal mark there, and then I can try to soften out the square with vertical brush strokes. And same thing on the bottom. Now again, this is where it's really important that we have an opaque layer of paint. So even though the pigment in this mixture is transparent, you have to use a thicker amount of paint to not see the paper underneath the paint. So if you can see moments where it looks like there's paper showing through, you want to make sure that you go back over it. Now if you're trying to do that and you're just moving paint around and you can still see the paper, what I would recommend then is letting that start to dry, and then when it's a little bit more tacky, try to use a thicker amount of paint and just go over that area. Or you can let it dry completely, and then if you still have that mixture on your palette, you can go in and paint over that, if that makes sense. So yeah, let me show kind of a close-up of the result here. And as I'm kind of looking at the palette versus the chart, again, it's a lot easier to see and compare our colors when they're in a chart like this. So the thing I noticed right away is that these two lighter grays are really, really close together, and I feel like there's a lot of space between this middle and the yellow. So I think, if I was going to continue to fix this, what I would try to do is adjust these two rows so that this is a little bit closer to yellow, which opens up more room between what would be this swatch and the next one. Because what I could do, again, if this was a really quick and easy fix, which I'm not going to show in the video because it would take a while, but just as an example of how to analyze your results. So let me see if I can bring this a little closer for us. So again, this row here could probably go closer to the yellows, and then this can move closer into like this territory, and then that means that this row can move closer into this territory, if that makes sense. It's a challenge because I feel like this is fairly close to a neutral, especially compared to the yellow here. So I'm a little bit hesitant to try to adjust my middle neutral because I'm afraid that it'll read as slightly too brown or too gold. But I do think that these two rows are very similar to one another, and there's definitely some space that needs to be adjusted there. But because I'm out of my paint and I want to keep this video short as possible, I'm not going to show that on camera. But just again, as another example of a way to fix our charts, that's how you would go about analyzing the results. I hope that this was helpful. There'll be plenty more videos like this that I'll be sharing during the semester to kind of demo things. And if you have questions, feel free to let me know. I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. That way I have some time before class starts. But thanks for watching the full thing. If you just kind of skipped through the video, that's okay too. Really, this is just a way to demonstrate the process and some tips on how you might want to, think about the order of operations here. So again, I hope that was helpful. And yeah, I'll talk to you soon. Thanks again for watching.